We are beginning a new series, a 7-week series on the person of God. Our small groups, our children, we're all following the same study for the next upcoming weeks. And as would be expected, I'm taking a theological approach to the study opposed to a philosophical approach, where a theological approach begins with the idea that we presuppose that God exists. Where a philosophical approach begins with everything's on the table and there's really not a starting point. Everything is okay, nothing is a given. But I want to be upfront with what I'm not trying to do, what we're not trying to do for the next 7 weeks. And I'm not trying, as I just mentioned, I'm not trying to prove the existence of God. And it's not an apologetic slant where I'm not trying to defend the existence of God or who God is. And I'm not looking at the attributes of God, like His omniscience, omnipotence, omnipresence, or any other omni we could think of. What I am doing is I'm trying to set us on a path that will lead us towards a lifelong discovery of this person that we call God, or that we refer to as God. More specifically, I want us to be able to reverently embrace the unsearchableness of God, that which we will never be able to understand, what would be a mystery. And that whatever is a mystery about God to you and to me, instead of it being a stop to my learning or a frustration, or that it would lead to doubts, that actually the mystery would lead to a life of awe and wonder and to more worship. Anselm of Canterbury, he's an 11th century monk, and he was a theologian, he's a professor. He's made famous for something called the ontological argument. But he also stated that God is that which no greater can be conceived. God is that than which no greater can be conceived. And we think, wow, he was made famous for that. I could have wrote that. Right? We think about those things, that if there is a God, and even skeptics and atheists would agree that if there was a God, then they're intrinsic in the name God. There would be nothing greater. There would be nothing superior to the person, because it's in our definition of what God is. Anselm also believed that there were two ways something could exist. First, it could exist solely in our mind as an imagination. He said, like yellow unicorns, or you pick the color of the unicorn, pink unicorns, blue unicorns. It can exist in our imagination, or it could exist both in our imagination and in real life. So like a cookies and cream milkshake from Chick-fil-A that can exist in my mind, and it actually exists. I'm so glad that it does actually exist. He also believed that the only way that something imagined or thought about in your mind could be greater is that if it had a real version to it. And again, we think, man, monk, theologian, philosopher, very famous for these things. We know this stuff. We could have said those things. We could have been famous like Anselm of Canterbury. If the only way something greater could exist that's in our imagination is if it would really happen, if it would be a real version of it. So we know that. Like, I know some of you guys, some girls, y'all are looking for that special someone, right? You're looking. And right now, you won't admit it, but you single people, you have this idea and this picture of that just right person. Right? You think, what could be better than that image that you have? Him or her, right? That would be better. That's the only way that image could get better, is if there was a real life version of that person. Or those of us who are planning a vacation for this year, we're thinking about it, and one day I want to take my family to Colorado. We've been skiing. My wife and I have been skiing many times, but my girls haven't been skiing. And I look forward to the day they be on the, right up the lift and get off on the slopes. And the first time that we get to go and crash together and just be together, and they get to experience gliding down the snow together. But the only way that's going to get better, as I can imagine in my mind, is that when it actually happens, in the day that we as a family are going down the slopes together, and we're staying at the lodge, and we're going to the little villages together. Now, I think that most of us would conclude, and I think that most atheists that I have interaction with, I have contact with, and most skeptics that I have contact with, and friends of mine, that they would agree with the idea that if God would exist, then there could be nothing greater that could be imagined, because just that's the definition of God. Now, if you are a Christian, that presupposes that you have a perspective of who God is. It means you have an idea. I'd love to be able to hear your idea of God and what we would call your portrait of God. And your portrait of God has, you've arrived at your portrait of God because of many different life events. So some people are very angry at God, right? Because maybe a death in the family or an unfortunate thing happened to you. And so God is mean, God is bad, God's not powerful, God's not in control. Or things have been really good for you. Or maybe you've worked through the bad and you have greater faith in God because He's brought you through it. Or all the voices in your life that's told you about God. Teachers and parents and friends. So there's a culmination right now as you sit here. There is a portrait of God. You have a portrait, a picture of what you think God's like. Not so much physically, but in His character and His nature and why He does things. And a portrait is subjective. A portrait is how you view something from your angle. So you think about if you go to a carnival or you go to the fair and you have that person that's sitting there and you pay money so they can draw you and make you look really silly. And that person will accentuate certain features on your face, right? Now, I've never done this, and I'm scared to do it. I don't want a caricature of me because I know exactly what they're going to make big. I'm going to have this big nose about this big, and my eyebrows are going to be so bushy you can't even see my eyes, and my eyelashes are going to come out here, like I got fake eyelashes on. So I'm not even going to pay my $20, $25 for me to be embarrassed by this person. But what they're doing is they're drawing a portrait of you as they see you. And that's what our portraits are. It's what we think somebody is like. And there's so many different portraits of God just in this room. So many different definitions, so many different ideas. You think about most civilizations ever, since the beginning of time, had some idea of God. No matter how abstract or how concrete or how weird or how accurate it may be, they've had this idea. You think about Greek mythology. They've had portraits of God. Egyptian civilization, Babylonian. And you go all through the times. Individuals have this idea of who God is. People across the world from us have different ideas of who God is. And that's to be expected. I remember as a little kid, I'd ask my mom, how do we know that we're serving the right God? Because there's people across the world. They're being taught about another God, and they're thinking the same thing about us. And they have a different portrait. Like if they would draw God, their portrait would be much different than the way that I would draw God. And the only way that we would have the ability to know if our portrait is true is if there was an actual object or being or person that we could compare the portrait to and put it side by side and say, oh, well, here's the differences and here's the similarities. See, you'd have to have a photo, really, to make sure that your portrait is accurate. Because what a photo does, a photo captures the image not from your perspective, but actually as it is, captures the essence of that. So if, me and my daughter, Ambry, we were drawing a portrait of you. We just came up here right now, and I said, okay, smile real big. And you smiled, and I started drawing your picture. And she was drawing your portrait as well. And then at the end, we would compare. There would be differences, right? If you drew a portrait of somebody in your family, and you had someone else draw the same portrait of someone in your family, there would be differences. You may put a halo on somebody, and the other one may put horns on somebody, right? No, she's got horns right now. There's going to be difference. But if Ambry and I, my daughter, if we took a picture of you from the same angle, and then we compared photos, the photos would be exactly the same because the photo is capturing the essence of that image.